So I have been a recent addition to the health sciences market. I started in about 2015 with a company called Illumina. They do genomics and genetic sequencing. And my role there was to create a foundation for KOL engagement that had not yet existed with that company. And over the 10 years I was there, that really grew into a global function, encompassing not just medical affairs, but also commercial marketing, R&D, PR, anyone who touches the customer or might want to engage with a key opinion leader. Um, while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet a number of key opinion leaders in oncology, women's health, rare disease, infectious disease, cardiology, so many brilliant minds in medicine and research. And I had the opportunity to work with them on speaking engagements, advisory boards, work with my colleagues internally to create and hone a speakers bureau, global speakers bureau for Illumina, and really define what our ground rules were. Like, who are our KOLs? They're not just HCPs, right? They could be genetic counselors, they could be nurses, medical students, et cetera. So we really worked through um, what that looked like for us as a team at the organization.
Sure. And you were originally working in electronics. So how would you
Yeah.
that's an interesting background to come into health sciences with. But obviously, you would have been able to draw the dots, join the dots quite quickly. And how do you feel that those two careers differed and were the same?
Yeah, so it is a very different kind of environment, but what I found was I built really foundational and transferable skills and experiences that could translate regardless of the sector that you were in. So, for example, in electronics, with Sony, I had the opportunity to work with experts that really moved the needle for that business. So we would call them our key opinion leaders or our SMEs or external experts, and working with PR and marketing and the product development team, identify who those folks were in our ecosystem. So that's where the similarities come between, thinking about working with key opinion leaders and health sciences and working with, say, an expert on AI or battery technology or digital imaging in the consumer electronics space, and really leveraging their expertise to make us better and to give them the kind of information they need for the work that they do. So that in the end, the customer or the patient gets the best of what we have to offer. So for me, that was how they were the same. In terms of different, I think it's a real shock to the system if you've not been in life sciences to understand what the regulatory requirements are. Um, and, it's not just the regulatory requirements in your country. Sometimes it's even in the United States, it could be by specific state. And so that was a lot to take in and understand and make a part of that process. The regulatory work that we might have run into in an electronics business was really more about, is this product safe to use, and not, were we, spending too much money or influencing the spend of a customer per se. So that's how it was a little bit different.
Sure. And tell me so working with Illumina, what would you say? Obviously, identifying KOLs is one thing, but there would have been certain KOLs who would have been more kind of ideal, I suppose, than others. So part of that process is not only to identify an ideal KOL looks like, but then to kind of, I guess, build rapport with different individuals to, I guess, build that relationship moving forward in the way that you can to ensure both parties are, getting something out of the interaction. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think before you decide on who you want to engage and who might be the ideal candidate, you have to start with the end in mind. So, what are you hoping to achieve? when you engage with this particular expert, and you know, is it um going to be a long-term relationship or a short-term relationship? Is it a, just a one-off situation? And then I think in terms of what we do with those folks, it also begins with your internal relationships. So, for example, I sat in the corporate marketing organization, but I partnered with colleagues in medical and science affairs, as well as R&D, and us, of course, our strategic account managers, to understand, what was going on at the time with a particular key opinion leader we wanted to target. They may have been working on an evidence generation project with the medical affairs team, or they may be, at a customer site where they just had a new installation and they're ramping up. And so really understanding those key moving parts helps you decide who we're going to approach and why we're going to approach them and how does that meet our end goal.
And those interactions that the MSLs were having with the KOLs, how did you
Mhm.
go about ensuring that each of those interactions would be as fruitful as possible?
Yeah. So initially at Illumina, there wasn't really a framework or infrastructure around what those ground rules were. So in working with medical affairs folks and across each of the functional or parts of the organization, we really defined what our swim lanes were. There was early on pulled together an executive steering committee that said, here's what the priorities are for the organization around key opinion leader engagement. Here's what our top three, you know, uh, uh, avenues are that we're thinking about, or, whatever that might be. And then there was a functional working team across medical, commercial, R&D, et cetera, to really execute that. So in medical, for example, we really defined what those swim lanes were from around, evidence generation, education, um, support, et cetera. And then from a commercial point, taking it through the funnel of the awareness and education that started in the medical sales liaison group and moving it into how do we execute that for content or sales enablement tools, et cetera, that then go to the field. So it was really a cross-functional team in every clinical segment to think about that entire pull-through process from medical through to sales.
Sure, and that pull through part's very interesting. So, what would the average MSL? I mean, how what was the frequency, the ideal kind of frequency of interactions with KOLs? And what did you have expectations that you set up in a quantitative sense of what you believed? An MSL ought to be doing in terms of meetings per month or and how long were these interactions, and what were, some achievable goals you set in terms of charting that kind of next best action, the quality of the interaction, what both parties were getting out of it, and so forth.
Yeah, to be completely transparent, that was not my purview, but I would engage with the leadership of the MSL team. And I know that they had their own engagement process and their own tools for setting what that set of level of process was. I think one of the things that I was able to support the organization for, particularly in, the MSL organization as well as the other functional areas, was benchmarking with our own KOL database of folks that we engaged regularly, and comparing that to an external survey of KOLs that worked with other life science brands to see what were the recommendations or what were the needs of those KOLs that were not being met currently either by ourselves or by other brands in life sciences industry. And what we found were that there was three places where we could really engage with them in between the specific assignments, if you will, or the, you know, particular projects that we had signed up for. And the first bucket was really around communication ahead of time of the project. My dad used to say, measure twice, cut once. And a lot of the data we got back from KOLs on our benchmark survey was I don't get enough information up front before we start the engagement. Like, I really need specific sets of data. I need them summarized. I need to understand what the outcome intention is, where, starting with the end in mind, where do you want to go? And then post engagement, there was a lot of requests to say, how did it work out? What did you decide to do? Where are you in this process? Like, how did what I did, how is the work that I did with you impacting what your goal was for your, end in mind? And then lastly, to a lesser extent of those first two communication pillars were really about helping that KOL develop their brand. A lot of them were just discovering Twitter at the time when we started this process, and LinkedIn as long form content. And there was a desire to support them in their journey of developing their own personal brand. Whether that was helping them amplify their content or um, providing content for the work that they did with us so that they could share it and it would give a boost to them. There were lots of ways to do that. Um, so, the three buckets are communication, insights on what happened afterwards, and then supporting their brand in those channels.
You mentioned also in that material you shared with me a few weeks ago about this idea of helping these MSLs to learn a new skill, as you say.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of what that might be in terms of, how often they might do that, the kind of internal and external input that you would and support you would provide for them to help them to kind of make that as part of their toolkit, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. So let me talk about a particular situation I had, and it was both with the MSLs and with the product development team. And that was we had a situation where there were two specific KOLs that kept being brought up for examples. One was here in the United States, and one was in Germany. And more than 15 people, so 18 for one and 22 for another, had reached out from the company to invite these two different KOLs to engage with us on the same exact thing. So there were multiple touch points. And what the skill set I'm talking about and what's different is thinking about who are your internal colleagues that you need to connect with to understand what they're doing and what they're working on and why they might be thinking about working with the KOL, build those internal relationships so that we can reduce that KOL friction that I just talked about, which was the more than a dozen, almost 2 dozen outreach to these two different KOLs. And think of yourself as the first touch point of the brand, of the culture, of who your company is to that KOL. So you're in the field as an MSL. That's probably not something that you think of being a marketer or a brand ambassador, but you are the first touch point. You're the first representation of your company's brand to any person outside the organization that you might want to approach, be it customer or KOL for engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, you mentioned trying to increase touch points between the MSL and KOL,
Hmm.
over the course of the relationship, I guess. What are some of the best examples you've seen of just in a meaningful but obviously light touch way to
Yeah.
keep that dialogue going?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I also did a little poll before I talked about this document that we shared uh, around what were the ways that MSLs were currently doing it and what were the ways that they wish they could do it. And then compared that to something we did try at Illumina when I was there, which was the buddy system. And so we created a framework that um, enabled very specific uh, individuals, roles within the organization who would create those touch points between the major engagements or when data was available from the work that they had started. And so we started with the social media buddies, and it might feel a little juvenile or a little, um, personal, but it isn't. You know, if you go back to that third item that KOLs wanted, which was support in building their own personal brand online, social media was a natural place for us to go for that. And so what we tried was identifying, you know, a dozen high touch KOLs that were trying to, we knew they were trying to build their brand online. We had worked with them or we had a project in place and we tested the idea of being their social media internet support system, you know, engaging with their content, following them, providing them content, you know, that might support the discussions they were having about the research that they were publishing already. uh, just really being their cheerleader online. It can get a little out of hand, so people get excited about it at the organization. And at one point, I had like an entire executive suite in one organization follow everyone at the same time, and then they had their entire teams follow everyone at the same time. So within 3 days, there were 25 or 30 Illumina people following one KOL. And so it's, you know, it was a lesson learned. It's sort of thinking about when you're starting to build a new friendship or you're trying to build a relationship with a key opinion leader offline, those rules still apply online,
Yeah.
even though you're trying to help them. So that was a fun lesson. But those were some of the ways that we did that. Some other things I think people have thought about and have worked well with them. And I think it depends on the KOL and it depends on the MSL, is to share additional research or industry publications that have relation to the work that that KOL is doing. And give a point of view on it and say, hey, I think this might be helpful if you haven't had someone, you know, looking into this. Here's how I can help you. Summarize research for them that supports what they're doing. And that seemed to be a favorite among the folks that I polled was to share additional content for those KOLs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose as you track the activities and the way that these MSLs talk about their different interactions, it must be interesting to see, you know, a young MSL who's super keen to share all the data and kind of get all that out there, through to somebody who's more experienced and obviously understands the relationship a bit more and becomes a lot more strategic in the manner in which they engage. Perhaps you can unpack that a little bit for us by maybe profiling one of your, a person who you identified as being a pretty outstanding performer and why.
Yeah, I think uh, that's an interesting one because on the one hand, you really appreciate the energy and the enthusiasm of a more junior person who's ready to get going. And for the most part, I say, you know, keep that open. I worked on a team shoulder to shoulder with an MSL in the oncology space, and our VP um, really sort of gave him carte blanche to do what he needed to do. And what he was able to do was to work with a society and really analyze some specific data around a particular cancer type and create like a trend analysis of all of that data, and support the KOLs who were officers or committee members in that society with summarized content so that they didn't have to spend nights reading all of that research and figuring out what it meant to them in terms of making the guideline recommendations. And what happened was, over the course of 6 or 8 months, this work went on, and he was able to support their next decision around guidelines for colorectal cancer. So it was a very unique experience. I don't think everyone can do that, but I think in some cases it's the right fit for the right time. So this younger MSL had the energy and the desire to drive and do it, and he had a receptive set of KOLs who were ready to receive that information.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this these three pillars of communication, insights, and support. Perhaps
Right.
perhaps you could just break those down a little bit for us.
Yeah. I think regular and consistent communication was the number one thing that KOLs, or at least the KOLs that we engaged with and surveyed, had asked for. Even if just to say, you know what, the data's not ready yet, but we're excited about what we're seeing. Here's what's coming. And, we think we'll be able to touch base with you in 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is. The other thing I think is just to check in and see how they're doing. Is there anything that we can support you with? Was another kind of request. And then the third one was really to have a dedicated communications team. And we saved this. We worked on this for what we would sort of consider high touch KOLs. They have a global reputation. They are often in high demand, and so that they don't get the 18 or 20 invitations from internal colleagues, we designed a team for them. So there was an executive assigned to their team, there was an operations person, there was sort of a project person. So whoever the MSL was that was working on the specific project with that KOL at the time would be a part of that team. And then there was a communications person also assigned to that team. And so what happened for that high touch KOL, that sort of globally known person, is they could have ultimate and unlimited communication with their executive buddy. And in this case, it was our chief medical officer. And then from an operations point of view, I actually took on that role given that I ran the speakers bureau and in our operational framework. And so I would be the one that would reduce that internal friction for that KOL, whether it was around contracting or payments or logistics, whatever it was. I would get the right people for that KOL to make it easier for them. And then the MSL or the marketing manager who was working with that KOL on the deliverable would be that regular touch point for that project timeline. And what I got back from that experiment, for one of this particular high visibility KOLs in cardiology, is we had a global genomics event and he was a keynote panelist. And in the green room, he grabbed my hand and said, Christina, this has been the best experience I've ever had at the company. I've got the right people at the right time for the right information when I need it. So I think that can't be done certainly for every KOL, in terms of communication, but you can stratify your KOLs and assign a certain kind of communication profile. From the insights piece, I think that's really driven by the MSL, who is driving that particular data project with them, or paper creation, summary, data summary, et cetera. And I hate to say that we prescribed a process there because we really didn't. We just talked about what it could look like and that it would be determined by the ground rules the KOL and the MSL would set up in terms of communication. Um, and in terms of supporting their brand, I go back to that buddy system. They have social channels, they have career and company goals for themselves, much like we do at our career, for our career and our company. Um, and there are opportunities at, say, congresses and conferences to help them support their brand, depending on what we've got going on. And oftentimes there could be some overlap with what the company needs and what the KOL needs at those congresses and conferences in terms of speaking opportunities or paper presentations, posters, et cetera.
Absolutely. And I suppose just in regard to that, you talked a little bit about this already, but you mentioned this expression starting with the end in mind. And
Hmm.
if we identify or sort of profile this relationship between the MSL and the KOL, I suppose there are ends of the next chapter, and then there is the end, so to speak. Give us a little bit on that in terms of how that, I guess, acts as a rudder for the MSL in terms of the actions they take, follow up, etc.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because very oftentimes what I experienced, and my time at Illumina with MSLs and KOLs, is that their end in mind overlaps, but what doesn't always overlap are maybe those chapters that you talked about. And so that requires flexibility, open communication, collaboration, and really thinking through those as they happen. And I think at least the MSLs that I have met and worked with, it seems to be a natural skill set. It's almost dare I say, borrowing from our sales colleagues, some of their skill set. And so I think it works nicely when they try to put themselves in the shoes of the KOL and also hold the paradox of what the company needs. It's a tough road to follow, but there is an opportunity there for growth, and there's an opportunity there for something unexpected, which could be really great.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? So much is discussed in relation to this relationship between the KOL and the MSL. And, as I observe it as an outsider to health sciences, it seems to me that the operation of status is a very important one, because the MSL, there has to be mutual respect and whatever, but sort of the KOLs kind of, so it's a sort of almost a co-pilot situation, isn't it? I mean, what have you noticed about when a relationship's really humming between an MSL and a KOL? What are the kind of hallmarks of that relationship?
Yeah, I think I have a great example from one of my colleagues on the oncology side of the business, and he said he knew he was sort of in the zone, if you will. If you're a sports guy and if you've played sports, you feel like when you're in at this moment when you're working with your teammates and your coach and everything's going and humming well and it's just smooth and there are no hiccups. Um, he said, "Look, if I can text my KOL and just ask him how he's doing, or you know can't wait to connect with you next time, and I get a text back right away, I feel like we've made that progress. Like I'm considered an extension of his team or her team. And um and I think, that's transferable to almost any role in any kind of organization. I used to be a support person in my role at the electronics company. And if I showed up on the org chart of the head of PCs or digital imaging as a partner, then I knew that that was a real connection for us um, a, a an expert and a support person. So I think that's one of the ones that sticks in my mind. um, the other one was, you know, when we would reach out to a KOL and we would have their main point of contact, be it an MSL or an executive, reach out and ask them to speak for us. And they would say, yeah, absolutely. When, where, and how? Like immediately, no questions asked, except like, what can I do to help serve you? I think those are the sort of the hallmarks of when it works well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anything further to add at this point?
Yeah, I think the only other thing is to think about, when you think about trying any of these new skills, like being a social media supporter and follower and whatnot, is to really, not only think about the end in mind, but think about it as a new skill, and you're not going to be great at it at first, but over time, much like the work that you have learned to become the amazing MSL that you are today, those too will start to become part of your skill set and part of your repertoire, and it'll be a lot easier in terms of thinking of yourself as a brand ambassador, trying a new communication avenue, adding stuff to your normal schedule of engagement with a key opinion leader, those in between communication pieces. Um, all of that will get easier and become more part of your repertoire over time with practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to have a look at this sense of continuity, isn't it? I mean, I had I had a daughter say to me the other day, "Oh, she was saying how she has this new boyfriend, and that now she can officially announce that he is her boyfriend." And I was like, "Oh, that's all very sort of formal of you." I said, "Did that? Because they're all using apps nowadays
Yeah,
as a way to meet one another." I said, "Is this part of the sort of overlap of the app? Is the app concerned that it's missing you now, and that you've now moved on to the stage of being in a relationship, so that you no longer use it? So now it's giving you new kind of milestones to meet. So
yeah,
it is interesting, but I suppose for the MSL and the KOL, having those ongoing, and they compared to an HCP, especially in primary care, and a rep, where the volume of people to see. I think the real joy in the relationship between the MSL and the KOL is that these relationships can be richer and more long lasting based on that enthusiasm for a very specific therapy area and patient outcomes and the depth of knowledge around science and so on.
Yeah, absolutely, Marcus. I think it's interesting your example of the dating with your daughter, because that was one of the things that I used early on in an internal conversation was think about it as dating. Like you wouldn't love bomb the KOL right away, and there are certain gates of when you announce, or get to a certain level of relationship. But you're right, it's exactly like that.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, isn't it? Because I'll often use sort of I guess dating etc. analogies when I talk about communication, be it sales or be it medical information and things that are a little more sort of scientific. I mean, in the end, all of these skills, and I think this is one of the most disappointing things about the insistence of some medical affairs teams to remain so separate to the commercial teams, is that it's a missed opportunity, because I think a lot of these people, especially the really experienced ones in sales, have extraordinary skill in communication. So
Hmm.
a little more of that skill coming into the MSLs, and combining with their therapy area knowledge. I think you're looking at a killer mix right there. I think, and that's sort of, I believe, the goal for a lot of MSL development. That's that we're looking at in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's key. I do have one more last example to really talk about that
Mhm.
experience. So, there is this firewall or this break between medical and their sales colleagues, yet they could learn a lot from each other and support each other in ways that they probably aren't right now. And in my experience at Illumina, there were group of folks that fell under the marketing umbrella, but they were called market development. So almost like a field sales rep, but in marketing. And they had a much easier path to both medical and sales. So sort of the bridge between the two. And I think that worked really well in supporting that transfer of knowledge, or like that pull through of information through to the sales enablement team, and vice versa. So that's an interesting dilemma. I think it depends on the organization and leadership and how comfortable they are, and certainly what sector they're in. Some sectors are more um, uh, risk averse around that kind of connection than others. But yeah, you're right.
Sure.
There's a lot to be learned for both folks in those roles.
Yeah, and I think a bit more sort of, I think people are a little sort of, as you say, squeamish and risk averse. So rather than just addressing it directly and saying, here's the line, you stay on that side and, we'll stay on this side, sort of becomes this sort of, thing that is, sort of feared and unsaid, which probably leads to more mistakes rather than necessarily just, I think that this is where the definition of the role is so important, because if your role is clearly defined, be that in commercial or medical, then you're not going to tread on the other person's toes. Your two roles are going to be complementary, and
That's right.
I think that is where things ultimately need to get to.